Imagine, for a moment, a land unmarked by highways, cities, or fences. The vast expanse of the Americas stretched out in untouched grandeur, towering peaks clawed at the sky, rivers roared through endless green, and plains rolled on for days, vibrating with the thunder of countless bison hooves. Into this sweeping wilderness stepped the first chapters of a human story, one so old it feels almost mythical, yet so real that its echoes are still carried in the blood of descendants today. Long before anyone thought to call this place America, long before explorers drew maps or settlers built homes, the ancestors of today's indigenous peoples began arriving. Their journey wasn't some simple campfire migration tale, it was an odyssey, wrapped in mystery and daring choices, where survival often depended on courage and chance. Scholars have argued about when it began, but most agree that a frozen highway of land once linked northeastern Asia to what is now Alaska. This bridge of earth and grass, known today as Beringia, emerged when oceans receded during the last ice age. Picture the conditions: an unforgiving plain swept by knife-like winds, where every breath seemed to turn solid in the air. Men, women, and even children braved it, pushing forward as mammoths and giant bison moved steadily across. They weren't reckless travelers. They were disciplined hunter-gatherers, armed with little more than stone-tipped spears and an unbreakable determination. Some were barely teenagers, already carrying the responsibility of watching herds or hauling meat, while elders whispered stories of spirits guiding them toward a new world. But this crossing was not simply one way. New research suggests that for generations, families and clans moved back and forth between Siberia and the Americas, carrying with them songs, tools, and genetic ties that braided together continents. Even so, there were mysteries, peoples who seemed to vanish into the northern tundra, leaving only faint genetic footprints like shadows in the snow. One such branch, often called the Beringians, lingered in Alaska for centuries before fading, a silent chapter in a vast epic. To imagine them is to imagine resilience carved into flesh and bone. A mother wrapping her infant in fur, shielding against the howling night. A hunter, no older than 20, stepping onto a glacier's edge, scanning the horizon for prey large enough to feed dozens. A family staring at the horizon, knowing that beyond the endless whiteness lay a land brimming with promise and peril. Their journey wasn't merely survival. It was the opening act of a saga that would span tens of thousands of years. From this frozen bridge, footsteps spread southward, eastward, into deserts, forests, and mountains, carrying with them not just bodies, but the seeds of cultures that would one day shape the identity of a continent. These early wanderers weren't simply drifting across empty landscapes, they were experts at survival, hardened by the unforgiving world of the Ice Age. They pursued colossal beasts across the endless mammoth steppe, a frozen grassland stretching from the edges of Europe into the heart of North America. Imagine a hunting party made up of families, fathers barely past 20, teenagers eager to prove themselves, and women carrying sharpened tools, closing in on a woolly mammoth, a creature that stood taller than a house and weighed more than a dozen oxen. Their only weapons were stone-tipped spears, fire-hardened courage, and the coordination of a tightly knit band. Archaeological discoveries reveal just how skilled they were. In the region we now call New Mexico, at a site named after the town of Clovis, fluted spear points have been found still lodged in the bones of mammoths. These weren't the tools of amateurs, they were precision weapons crafted by hands that knew the cost of failure. But here's where the mystery deepens: some scholars insist humans arrived even earlier. Excavations at Monte Verde in Chile show signs of habitation nearly 18,500 years ago, suggesting that people either sprinted across the continent with astonishing speed or, more daringly, navigated the Pacific coastline by boat. The thought of Ice Age travelers braving stormy seas in wooden vessels challenges everything we once assumed about human audacity. By 12,000 years ago, these people had spread from the icy north of Alaska all the way down to the windswept plains of Patagonia. They adapted to deserts that baked the earth by day, rainforests thick with insects and humidity, and mountains crowned with snow. At Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, evidence from 19,000 years ago tells us they weren't just passing through. They built semi-permanent camps, tended fires in stone-lined hearths, fished in rivers, and gathered whatever nature provided, berries, roots, even seaweed. Analysis of ancient dental plaque reveals that they chewed on cattail stalks and resin from pine trees, the closest thing to chewing gum in prehistory, though probably not the minty kind we'd recognize. Life on this continent wasn't an endless adventure. The Ice Age was merciless, marked by sudden climate swings that could change temperatures by 10 degrees in a single lifetime. Entire families were forced to move or adapt overnight. And predators lurked everywhere, giant bears that could outpace horses, packs of dire wolves, and cats with saber-like teeth. To make one mistake was to become part of the food chain. And yet, they didn't just endure. They flourished. They left behind bone flutes that whispered songs across the tundra, carved ornaments hinting at beliefs and traditions, and butchered remains in places like the Bluefish Caves of Yukon, proof that humans were thriving in the Arctic thousands of years earlier than once believed. Their persistence wasn't just resilience, it was sheer stubborn determination to carve a life out of the harshest of environments. Their tools only underline this brilliance. The Clovis hunters of New Mexico shaped razor-edged spear points so sharp they could puncture the thick hide of a mammoth. They wielded otlotls, spear throwers that hurled projectiles with the speed of a modern javelin, striking prey with lethal accuracy. Imagine hurling a spear at over 150 kilometers per hour, all while dodging a charging beast 3 times your size. This was no simple existence, it was a life of calculated risk, unshakable skill, and extraordinary courage. The hunters of this age weren't just skilled with spears, they were artisans of stone. In camps along riverbanks and valley floors, men and women sat patiently with obsidian and chert, chipping them into blades so sharp they could rival the knives of modern surgeons. But not every tool was meant for practical use. Some of their spear points were fashioned oversized, far too large to ever bring down a bison or mammoth. Instead, they seemed to carry another purpose, symbols of prestige, tokens of identity, or perhaps offerings to unseen powers. You can almost imagine a young warrior, maybe no older than 19, proudly displaying a massive, glistening spearhead to his companions, the Ice Age equivalent of a jeweled watch, a prehistoric way to declare, "Look at what I've made, look at who I am." But these people were more than hunters showing off their skill. They carried within them a reverence for life and for what lay beyond it. In what is now Montana, at a place we now call the Anzac Site, the grave of a small child, barely a toddler, was uncovered, buried with over 100 artifacts. Red ochre dusted the tiny body, stone blades surrounded it, and ivory beads accompanied the burial. This was no mere farewell, it was a message carved into time, an expression of belief that life stretched further than the earth itself. Elsewhere, in what is now Texas, stones engraved with geometric patterns were left behind, abstract art in a world most of us would struggle to survive a single week in. These people, while facing wolves and hunger, still found the time to shape beauty into rock. Yet even as they thrived, the great age of giants was nearing its end. By around 11,000 years ago, the mammoths, mastodons, and ground sloths that had walked beside them were disappearing. Some scholars point the finger at climate change, warming weather melting glaciers, transforming tundra into forests, unraveling the habitats of enormous animals. Others argue that human hunters, clever and relentless, played a decisive role. But to imagine these people as careless destroyers would be wrong. They hunted because they had to, because a 10-ton beast was survival for an entire clan. It was necessity, not greed. The loss of those creatures forced a turning point. Hunters who once aimed their fluted points at mammoths now turned them toward smaller prey, bison, deer, and even birds. From this shift grew new cultures, like the Folsom people, who crafted finer, more delicate spear points suited for swift, agile animals rather than lumbering giants. By 10,000 years ago, the world itself was shifting. Ice retreated, forests surged across lands once covered by snow, deserts opened wide under a sun that grew hotter year by year. And the descendants of the mammoth hunters adjusted with grace, inventing new lifeways and weaving new traditions. They weren't merely clinging to survival anymore, they were laying the first foundations of societies that would one day rival anything found across the ocean. The Ice Age was ending, but in that ending was a beginning. This was the dawn of the Archaic period, stretching from about 10,000 to 3,000 years ago. No longer were they only nomads chasing beasts across frozen plains. Now, they became innovators, architects of culture, shaping lives as diverse as the landscapes they lived in. And it is here, in this age of reinvention, that their story begins to unfold in ways far stranger and more fascinating than the hunt for mammoths could ever tell. This was a transformative age when survival no longer meant simply chasing after colossal beasts, but rather reshaping human ingenuity to match a changing world. The mammoths and sloths of old faded into memory, leaving families to reinvent their menus and their ways of life. No longer could a clan depend on one massive kill to sustain them. Instead, they turned to smaller prey, the river's endless bounty, and the wild plants surrounding their camps. It was the beginning of the Archaic period, when people became true masters of the ecosystems they inhabited, from the dusty basins of the west to the coastal rainforests of the northwest. Take the Great Basin, for example. Here, in caves now lost in desert silence, families gathered seeds, nuts, and grasses, grinding them with stones shaped by countless hours of labor. Picture a young woman, perhaps just 17, leaning over her metate, pushing kernels into flour with a heavy mano stone. The flour wouldn't taste like anything we'd crave today, closer to a bland cousin of bread, but it meant survival, and it tied her to generations before and after. Far to the east, along the rivers of what is now Kentucky, entire communities feasted on freshwater mussels. The evidence lies in massive shell mounds, or middens, some so vast they cover acres. Archaeologists later found burials woven into these piles of shells, suggesting that these feasts were more than nourishment, they were rituals, acts of respect for both the living and the dead. Imagine a gathering where families cracked open mussels by the hundreds, tossing empty shells into heaps, some destined to accompany loved ones into the afterlife. On the other side of the continent, the Pacific Northwest offered its own riches. The ancestors of the Chinook and Salish tribes became skilled fishermen, mastering nets and ingenious wooden traps to funnel salmon into woven baskets. By 7,000 years ago, they were harvesting not only salmon but clams, crabs, and seals, creating a diet as rich as it was sustainable. At the Hoko River site, fish hooks carved from bone have been found, so delicately made that even a modern fisherman might envy their design. Even stranger, some groups dried salmon into a form of early jerky, then traded it hundreds of miles inland. Long before modern supply chains, these people were moving preserved fish like valuable currency. And while food secured survival, artistry defined pride. Hunters still wielded the otlotl, the spear thrower, but they refined it with banner stones, polished hourglass-shaped weights that gave greater accuracy. Some were carved so beautifully they looked more like jewelry than tools. Imagine a hunter named Talek, no older than 20, showing off his carved banner stone, twirling it in the firelight as if to say, "I'm not only skilled enough to kill, but clever enough to craft beauty into my weapon." This era was about more than endurance. It was about innovation, ritual, and a certain flair for the unusual. These people didn't just adapt, they transformed survival into culture, and in doing so, laid the foundation for the diverse civilizations yet to come. Hunters of the Archaic Age didn't just rely on skill, they knew how to add flair to their craft. Along river valleys and rolling hills, young men carved otlotls with polished banner stones, shaping them into hourglass or wing-like forms. Some were so finely made they looked more like jewelry than hunting tools. Picture a boy of 18, eager to earn his place among the hunters, twirling his weighted otlotl at dusk as the elders looked on. He wasn't just preparing for a hunt, he was showing off, the way someone today might rev the engine of a prized car. These banner stones were more than functional, they were symbols of status, tokens of pride. And the sheer number unearthed at sites like Poverty Point in Louisiana, thousands upon thousands of them, hints at a society fascinated with both survival and style. But Poverty Point wasn't just about tools. Around 1700 BCE, this place became one of the greatest undertakings of its age. Imagine a sprawling settlement where families carried baskets of dirt, one after another, until towering mounds rose from the flat earth. The largest stretched 70 feet high and spread out in the shape of a massive bird, or perhaps a pyramid, depending on how you see it. Without carts, wheels, or metal shovels, they created monuments that reshaped their landscape. And it wasn't just local labor. Evidence shows Poverty Point was a thriving hub, its markets filled with copper from the far-off Great Lakes, jasper from the Appalachian ridges, and shells from the Gulf. This was no isolated village, it was the Amazon of the ancient world, a place where goods and ideas crossed vast distances. Agriculture was stirring too. In the eastern woodlands, people began taming wild plants like sunflowers, goosefoot, and marsh elder as early as 6,000 years ago. These weren't lush supermarket crops, they were humble seeds, slowly coaxed into reliability over generations. At sites like Coster in Illinois, archaeologists uncovered storage pits filled with these early staples. Imagine a young woman cracking open handfuls of sunflower seeds, each no bigger than her pinky nail, dreaming of the day when food might come with a little less effort. Even the tiniest seeds carried the promise of stability. Culture wasn't limited to food and trade. Across the Southwest, basket-making traditions flourished. The ancestors of the later Puebloan peoples wove yucca and willow into containers so tight they could hold water. At White Dog Cave in Arizona, archaeologists discovered sandals woven from plant fibers, some patterned with decorative designs. A hunter could cross desert sands in shoes not only practical but stylish, proof that survival didn't mean giving up beauty. And then there was the spiritual realm. At Windover Pond in Florida, a burial site preserved by the peat, bodies from 7,000 years ago were found astonishingly intact. Some still wore woven clothing, dyed in earthy pigments, and lay with tools or ornaments. One grave held a child, buried with a tiny carved turtle of bone, a toy, or perhaps a symbol of protection. It's a moment that makes you pause, realizing that even in an age of raw survival, love and tenderness found their place. This was no longer a world of desperate wandering. It was a world of networks, artistry, agriculture, and ritual, a civilization in the making, setting the stage for even greater societies to come. In the heart of the Archaic period, people were not only surviving but weaving rituals, aesthetics, and even peculiar customs into their lives. Burials from this age remind us how deeply they cared for the departed. At one site, a child was laid to rest with a small carved turtle made of bone. Was it a treasured plaything meant to accompany them into the spirit world? Or was it a sacred symbol, a talisman for the journey beyond? Either way, it shows that even amid the harsh realities of their time, they were guided by love, imagination, and beliefs that reached beyond death. These weren't faceless figures in history, they were families with affection, fears, and traditions, sometimes tender, sometimes unusual. Some customs, by modern eyes, may seem downright bizarre. In several communities, parents reshaped their infants' heads by binding them with boards or cloth, creating elongated or flattened skulls. At sites such as Port O'Shoy in Newfoundland, these altered skulls were uncovered, their shapes intentionally molded during early childhood. Was this beauty? Status? A mark of belonging? Whatever the purpose, imagine a mother deciding that her baby's appearance should match the ideal of her people, committing to years of careful shaping. It was fashion and identity taken to the most literal extreme. Yet, the Archaic age wasn't an endless golden era. Nature continued to test them. Around 8,000 years ago, dramatic warming events scorched parts of the Great Plains, drying lakes and parching fields. Communities had to abandon certain hunting grounds, shifting their diets toward small game and seeds. In the Great Basin, families leaned more heavily on rabbits, rodents, and wild plants, while in the southeast, rising sea levels swallowed coastal villages, forcing people inland to adapt once more. And still, they endured. It was as though they looked at a changing world and answered with quiet determination, "We'll find another way." By the closing centuries of the Archaic period, the stage was set for a transformation. These weren't just scattered nomads anymore. They had developed tools that cut finer, baskets that held water, trade routes that stretched across the continent, and traditions that gave their lives meaning. From the mound builders of the southeast to the fishers of the northwest, their roots had sunk deep into the soil of the Americas. What followed was astonishing. Around 3,000 years ago, societies began to grow more complex, flexing their cultural muscles in ways that would surprise even the boldest city planners. Monumental earthworks, organized trade networks, intricate rituals, and social hierarchies began to rise, rivaling anything happening across the oceans in Europe, Africa, or Asia. The Americas were no longer a scattered patchwork of hunter-gatherer camps, they were becoming centers of ingenuity and ambition. From towering mounds in the east to the cliffside dwellings of the southwest, the next era, known as the woodland period in the east and the formative elsewhere, marked the birth of societies that could leave behind legacies lasting thousands of years. This was no longer just survival, it was civilization in the making, a story about to take twists as strange, brilliant, and ambitious as any the world had ever seen. In the eastern woodlands, people began raising monuments that spoke louder than any words. One of the most astonishing was the mound at Grave Creek in what is now West Virginia. Towering 60 feet into the air, it wasn't built in a day or even a decade. Imagine generations of families carrying baskets of earth, mothers balancing woven containers on their hips, boys barely 12 hauling smaller loads, elders guiding the rhythm of the work. There were no carts, no beasts of burden, no metal tools. Just human willpower layered basket by basket until the hill rose into the sky. Within, the mound held burials adorned with copper bracelets, ornamental jewelry, and even a curious tablet carved with strange symbols. Some scholars believe it may hint at an early form of writing, though decoding it is like being handed a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The Adena people who built such mounds also expressed themselves in subtler, more intimate ways. They loved their pipes, not the ordinary kind, but masterpieces carved from stone into the shapes of animals, birds, and human faces. At Mound City in Ohio, archaeologists unearthed dozens of these ceremonial pipes clustered together in a single burial mound. It is unlikely they were for casual smoking. More likely they were sacred, used to call upon spirits during rituals or to display prestige. Picture a shaman seated by the fire, raising a hawk-shaped pipe as smoke curled into the night sky, the gathered villagers nodding gravely, even as some secretly admired the artistry. That is one magnificent pipe. Further south, the Poverty Point culture carried its traditions forward, thriving as the Archaic era gave way to the Woodland period. By around 1000 BCE, their trading network stretched astonishingly far. Imagine wearing shark teeth from the Gulf of Mexico or a grizzly bear fang from the distant Rocky Mountains. Such ornaments weren't just jewelry, they were symbols of power and reach. Poverty Point residents also shaped clay figurines, many of them female, with exaggerated features tied perhaps to fertility or ancestor worship. Some, however, had hauntingly realistic faces, as if the artisans had sculpted someone they knew. You can almost picture a sculptor grinning as they molded the likeness of an elder relative who had always scolded them for wasting time on art. Out west, in the deserts of the southwest, another culture was crafting its own kind of brilliance. The ancestors of the Puebloans, known to archaeologists as the Basketmaker Three People, began digging their homes into the ground. These pit houses, roofed with timber and packed with mud, became snug, cool shelters against the desert's scorching heat by day and bone-chilling nights. At Shabikashi village in New Mexico, archaeologists uncovered pit houses complete with fire pits, storage bins, and even early ventilation shafts. In essence, these desert builders were the HVAC engineers of their time, mastering airflow with ingenuity. But perhaps their greatest achievement came in farming. These people experimented with the three sisters, maize, beans, and squash. Their maize, however, was a far cry from the sweet corn on our dinner tables today. Early cobs were tiny, hardly bigger than a finger, with kernels no larger than peas. Generations upon generations patiently bred the crop, each season choosing slightly better seeds. Imagine the patience of families who worked lifetimes on a plant that would barely fill a meal, hoping their children's children might see the harvest improve. It was commitment carved into agriculture itself. From monumental mounds to pit houses sunk deep in desert soil, from ceremonial pipes to seeds coaxed into life, this was an age where creativity and endurance walked hand in hand. These people weren't just surviving, they were laying down traditions and innovations that would echo for millennia. While farmers in the dry Southwest were patiently tending tiny ears of maize, battling droughts and rattlesnakes with stubborn resolve, life in the Pacific Northwest was unfolding in a dramatically different way. There, the sea was the lifeline. The ancestors of the Haida and Tlingit didn't chase bison or grind seeds into flour, they mastered the waves. Along forested coasts, men carved enormous cedar trees into sleek vessels, some stretching 60 feet in length. These weren't small fishing boats, they were seaworthy canoes, capable of carrying dozens of people across turbulent waters. With them, entire families set out to fish, trade, and even raid rival communities. At Ozette, a coastal village in present-day Washington preserved by a mudslide nearly 1,700 years ago, archaeologists uncovered a treasure trove of wooden harpoons, fish hooks, and carved objects. One artifact, a whale fin delicately inlaid with otter teeth, was both tool and artwork. Imagine the pride of the craftsman, perhaps a man in his 30s, who spent weeks smoothing the surface, embedding tiny teeth into the wood. For him, it wasn't just decoration, it was a statement. A vessel or weapon adorned with animal parts carried meaning, courage, and perhaps even spiritual power. Far inland, another culture was shaping the land itself in ways that seemed to touch the heavens. Around 200 BCE in the Ohio Valley, the Hopewell culture rose to prominence. They took the art of mound building far beyond what came before. Their earthworks were immense, circles, squares, and even octagons, some stretching for miles across the landscape. These weren't random shapes. They aligned with the movements of the sun and moon, proof that the Hopewell tracked celestial cycles long before telescopes existed. Their reach extended across half a continent. What archaeologists call the Hopewell interaction sphere was essentially a prehistoric trade network, linking the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains. Obsidian, copper, and marine shells moved through their hands like currency. Some individuals wore copper ear spools that stretched their earlobes into striking displays. To us, it may seem unusual, but for the Hopewell, it was a mark of identity, fashion, and status, perhaps the Iron Age equivalent of a bold tattoo or designer shoes. Their artistry was no less spectacular. Like the Adena before them, the Hopewell crafted effigy pipes, but theirs were even grander. Some were sculpted with full scenes, a man locked in combat with a bear, animals frozen mid-leap, or birds with wings outstretched. Whether they captured actual events or vivid imaginations, these works were both ceremonial and expressive. In their burials, people were laid in log-lined tombs, accompanied by pearl beads, mica cut into shapes like hands or claws, and ornaments that had traveled hundreds of miles. Mica, fragile and shiny, was carried from North Carolina all the way to Ohio. Imagine hauling something as delicate as glass sheets across rugged terrain without it shattering. It was an act of reverence as much as ambition. This was a society growing more complex by the century. Leaders rose, not just from birthright but also through charisma, skill, or perhaps by flaunting the flashiest ornaments. Burials tell the story. Some were lavish, filled with artifacts, while others were modest pits in the earth. And at Windover Pond in Florida, DNA analysis of burials revealed that these weren't just loosely connected bands of people, they were families, tied by blood and tradition. It was a world of inequality, yes, but also one of kinship, ritual, and ambition. Not everyone lived in splendor, but everyone lived in a society that was rapidly becoming something greater than its beginnings. Archaeologists have uncovered sobering evidence that life during the late Archaic and Woodland eras was not always as glorious as the monuments and artifacts suggest. Skeletons from these communities often show the harsh toll of their diets and labor. Teeth were ground down by constant contact with grit, tiny bits of rock that slipped into flour as seeds were crushed against stone slabs. Arthritis gnawed at joints, evidence of long years spent grinding grain, hauling baskets, or bending over fields. Malnutrition, too, left its trace in frail bones. Imagine a young girl of 15, her teeth already worn, shoulders stiff from pounding seeds daily on a grinding stone, every meal flavored with dust. Survival was possible, but it carried a cost etched into the body. Yet what might surprise us most is their daring approach to medicine. Some groups practiced a procedure called trepanation, the drilling of holes in the human skull. To modern minds, the thought is staggering: stone blades pressed against bone, shaving and carving into the head. Whether this was done to relieve pressure from head injuries, to cure seizures, or for ritualistic purposes, we may never fully know. But some skulls show healed bone, proof that patients lived on after their ordeal. Imagine a healer, perhaps in their middle years, surrounded by family, carefully scraping bone while chanting prayers. It was part bravery, part desperation, and part belief that the spirits might guide their hand. By any measure, it was an achievement that rivals the courage of modern surgeons. Still, even innovation couldn't shield them from the shifting moods of the earth itself. Around 500 CE, climate changes rippled across the Americas. Cooler seasons disrupted harvests, pushing game animals to new ranges and leaving villages to scramble for solutions. In the deserts of the Southwest, the ancestors of the Puebloans responded with ingenuity. They began raising stone structures above ground, prototypes of the great pueblos that would later crown cliffs and valleys. Built of rock and mud, these early dwellings offered protection against raiders and the searing sun. Meanwhile, in the eastern woodlands, villages ringed themselves with palisades, wooden walls braced for conflict. For all their ceremonies and trade, these people knew competition could turn violent, and survival meant being ready. By the end of this period, Native American societies were poised for something bigger. The Hopewell with their star-aligned earthworks, the ancestral Puebloans with their agricultural expertise, and the canoe builders of the Northwest with their mastery of the sea, all had laid foundations for something grander. The continent was becoming a mosaic of ingenuity: stargazers who mapped the heavens, farmers who coaxed crops from parched soils, and seafarers whose cedar canoes cut across vast waters. And then came the leap. By about 500 CE, the Americas entered an age of cities and empires. Cultures were rising that could rival Rome or Egypt in complexity, artistry, and ambition. This was the dawn of the Mississippian world in the east, the golden age of the ancestral Puebloans in the southwest, and the height of maritime societies on the northwest coast. These weren't scattered survivors anymore. They were architects, artists, farmers, and rulers. They were building civilizations so remarkable that even today they make archaeologists pause, scratch their heads, and sometimes laugh in disbelief at the audacity of it all. By the time the Mississippian world reached its height, their city of Cahokia was larger than almost anything in Europe, bigger even than London in the same era. At its heart rose an astonishing achievement: Monk's Mound, an earthen pyramid that climbed 100 feet into the sky and spread across 14 acres. And remember, there were no iron tools, no carts, no draft animals to help. Every basket of dirt was carried by hand. Imagine the scene: a line of workers stretching into the distance, children no older than 12 helping to fill small baskets, while elders directed the endless flow of soil. Day after day, year after year, this communal effort raised a mountain from flat earth. At its summit stood a temple, where priests likely conducted ceremonies that linked the people to the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. Nearby, a wooden circle known today as Woodhenge stood tall, a ring of cedar posts carefully aligned with the solstices and equinoxes. It was their version of Stonehenge, but made of timber, and it functioned as both calendar and sacred space. When the sun rose between particular posts, the community knew it was time to plant maize, their most vital crop. Corn wasn't just a food source, it became the foundation of their culture. Families ground it into flour, baked it into flatbreads, and even brewed it into a fermented drink. Picture a festival evening in Cahokia: fires burning bright, drums beating, people sharing gourds of corn beer, laughing as the smoky air mingled with song. The brew may not have been smooth, but it bound the community together. Their artistry was no less impressive. At Spiro, in present-day Oklahoma, archaeologists uncovered engraved conch shells, copper breastplates, and beads brought up from the Gulf Coast. The carvings on some shells show warriors adorned in birdwing regalia and falcon motifs, almost like costumed heroes of their time. Trade networks stretched far, reaching the Great Lakes for copper, which was hammered into thin sheets for jewelry and ceremonial plates. One such copper plate from Etowah, Georgia depicts a figure clutching a severed head, a stark reminder that Mississippian life could be as violent as it was sophisticated. Ritual warfare or sacrifice may have been part of the order, unsettling to modern eyes but woven into their worldview. Meanwhile, far to the southwest, another culture was rising to its golden age. The ancestral Puebloans transformed desert mesas and valleys into thriving centers. By 900 CE, they were constructing vast, multi-story stone villages, like those at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. These weren't simple homes but architectural wonders with hundreds of rooms, ceremonial kivas, and roadways radiating out for miles, stone highways 30 feet wide, stretching across the desert. Why build such massive thoroughfares? Perhaps for trade, perhaps for pilgrimages, or perhaps simply to show their power. Whatever the purpose, the effort was monumental. Their great houses weren't just functional, they were cosmic instruments. Pueblo Bonito, the largest, was aligned so that at the solstice sunrise, shadows traced perfectly across its walls. To live there was to live inside a clock of stone, where the rhythms of the heavens dictated the rhythm of daily life. The ancestral Puebloans of the southwest pushed their ingenuity to almost impossible limits. Without horses, oxen, or carts to aid them, they carried heavy timbers across desert landscapes, some hauled from forests more than 50 miles away. Imagine a group of men, perhaps in their 20s, shoulders straining under the weight of massive logs, trudging mile after mile beneath the blistering sun. It must have felt like madness at times, yet those beams became the roofs of great houses, reminders that determination could carve civilization out of the harshest terrain. Their mastery didn't end with architecture. They were agricultural wizards, taming an unforgiving land with techniques that rival modern engineering. They grew the three sisters, maize, beans, and squash, on rocky soils, using clever systems like check dams and terraced plots to capture every rare drop of rain. At Mesa Verde, they went even further, constructing entire villages tucked into the cliffs themselves. Some of these cliff dwellings contained more than 150 rooms, stacked against canyon walls like stone beehives. But these weren't simply homes, they were fortresses. Their position, hidden in cliffs and accessible only by carved handholds or rope ladders, suggests that conflict or raiding neighbors were real threats. Picture a young farmer returning home at dusk, basket of corn tied across his back. Instead of walking through a doorway, he had to climb sheer rock, fingers and toes pressed into tiny footholds chipped into the cliff face. Each trip up was a vertical commute, every ascent a gamble against gravity. No elevators, no roads, just raw strength and nerve. Far to the north and west, life unfolded in a completely different rhythm. The Haida, Tlingit, and their neighbors thrived on the bounty of the sea. By 1000 CE, they had perfected a maritime economy that revolved around salmon runs, halibut fishing, and even the hunting of whales. Their cedar canoes, some stretching 60 feet, were masterpieces, carved from single logs and etched with clan emblems, ravens, orcas, and eagles. These weren't just boats, they were floating banners of identity and pride. At Namu in British Columbia, archaeologists unearthed evidence of fisheries dating back more than 6,000 years. The coast had been engineered for millennia, with weirs and traps guiding salmon into woven baskets. But the boldest feats were the whale hunts. Imagine warriors in canoes, paddling toward a 40-ton giant of the sea, armed with only bone-tipped harpoons and unshakable courage. To bring down a whale was to elevate the prestige of an entire clan, a story retold at every gathering. And those gatherings, the potlatches, were events unlike anything else. Chiefs threw immense feasts where wealth wasn't hoarded but given away, blankets, carved boxes, copper shields, and even canoes. The more you gave, the more respected you became. One preserved village, Ozette, revealed a wooden chest decorated with more than 700 sea otter teeth, a statement so lavish it was the equivalent of studding furniture with jewels. Yet life was not all celebration and trade. Power and wealth brought conflict. In Cahokia, some burials revealed elites surrounded by treasures, but also sacrificial victims, a chilling reminder of the costs of status. In Chaco Canyon, great kivas and ceremonial spaces hinted at powerful religious leaders guiding community life. On the northwest coast, chiefs commanded loyalty not only through lineage but also through their ability to give away riches. And across all regions, the remains of arrow wounds, scalping marks, and mass graves, like those of dozens of young women at Cahokia, speak of violence and ritual woven into daily existence. The Mississippians, for all their brilliance, were not a people living in a gentle utopia. Behind the monumental mounds and glittering artifacts lay shadows that could chill the imagination. At sites like Moundville in Alabama, pottery has been uncovered decorated with skulls, skeletal forms, and serpents with wings stretching wide. Were these the emblems of death cults, or symbols tied to warrior societies? Or perhaps they were the creations of artists with a taste for the macabre. Whatever their purpose, the designs leave a lingering unease, as if the line between sacred and sinister was deliberately blurred. Step into such a village at night, firelight flickering across painted pots, and you would feel a world half spiritual, half spooky, charged with mystery. In the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans were painting their own visions onto stone. Spirals etched into canyon walls, masked figures carved into sandstone cliffs, these were not idle doodles but symbols heavy with meaning. Many scholars believe they represented shamans, deities, or cosmological maps. One petroglyph in Utah even depicts a strange figure with a bulbous head and outstretched limbs, something that looks oddly like a person in a modern spacesuit. It was probably a stylized human or spirit figure, but it's hard not to smile at the thought of Puebloan artists carving astronauts long before rockets ever touched the sky. By 1200 CE, native societies across the Americas were at their cultural peaks, but those peaks carried strain. Cahokia, the jewel of the Mississippians, was bursting with tens of thousands of people. But so much growth came at a cost. The forests around the city were stripped for building material and firewood. Fields, exhausted by constant maize cultivation, began to decline. Soil depleted, crops faltered, and the once thriving city groaned under its own weight. Meanwhile, in Chaco Canyon, the great houses that had stood as symbols of order and community were abandoned after a brutal drought around 1130 CE. Families packed up and moved elsewhere, leaving behind empty stone walls and roads that led nowhere. The northwest coast fared better, blessed with salmon runs and coastal abundance, but even here, competition sparked tension. Rival clans fought over fishing grounds and trade routes, testing alliances that once seemed unshakable. For every potlatch feast filled with laughter and gifts, there were undercurrents of rivalry and unease. This was the turning of the age. The Americas had become a tapestry of thriving societies, each weaving its own pattern of ingenuity, ambition, and eccentricity. By 1200 CE, mountaintop cities ruled the southeast, cliff dwellings clung to canyons in the southwest, and great cedar canoes carved the waters of the northwest. But this wasn't a fairy tale, and the challenges were real. Droughts, rivalries, overfarming, and shifting climates pressed upon them, forcing choices that would decide their futures. At its peak, Cahokia still stood tall, Monk's Mound rising like a prehistoric skyscraper over the Mississippi River Valley. But the very food that had fueled its glory, maize, also betrayed its people. Their diet was so overwhelmingly corn-based that skeletons reveal malnutrition hidden beneath the abundance. Cavities riddled teeth, bones thin from lack of nutrients. Imagine surviving battles, famines, and predators, only to be undone by the very grain that built your city. It was a cruel twist, a reminder that even the most ambitious civilizations carry within them the seeds of their own decline. Life in Cahokia wasn't equal, and the evidence of that inequality lingers in the earth. At the top of society were the elites, who lived in large homes overlooking the plazas, while farmers, builders, and craftsmen labored below. Their power was not only political but also deeply symbolic, and nowhere is this clearer than in the burials they left behind. At Mound 72, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a man laid to rest with more than 20,000 shell beads, arranged in patterns that likely glittered like armor in the sun. But his burial was not solitary. For decapitated bodies and the remains of 53 young women were also found nearby, likely sacrificed as part of the ceremony. This wasn't just a funeral. It was theater. It was power displayed in the most visceral way possible, a message to the living that authority came with both splendor and terror. Other finds at Cahokia reveal the scope of its influence. In one area, a cache of more than 800 arrowheads was unearthed, each crafted from stone sourced from different regions. This suggests that warriors or emissaries from across the Midwest had converged here. Was it for a grand battle? A ceremonial display of strength? Or perhaps a gathering that bound far-flung communities together? Whatever the reason, the discovery feels like stumbling upon the remains of a prehistoric arms convention, each arrowhead whispering of alliances, rivalries, and the unending show of power. But the Mississippians weren't only about war and ritual. They also loved games, and their favorite was something called chunky. Players rolled a polished stone disc across the ground while others hurled spears, trying to land closest to where the stone stopped. Simple in theory, yet the stakes could be anything but. Some games were said to have been wagered with land, goods, or even freedom itself. Archaeologists have even found chunky stones in burials, some etched with animal motifs. One from Illinois bears the image of a rattlesnake, perhaps tied to clan identity or spiritual symbolism. Imagine betting your best canoe in a match, only to lose because a snake-carved stone rolled just a little farther than expected. While Cahokia dealt with its own triumphs and tensions, the ancestral Puebloans in the southwest were facing crises of a different sort. By 1150 CE, rainfall had nearly vanished from the region, leaving Chaco Canyon's grand houses struggling under decades of drought. Springs dried, fields turned to dust, and yet people adapted. At Mesa Verde, they began carving entire villages into sheer cliff faces, creating places like Cliff Palace with more than 150 rooms. These weren't just homes but fortresses, accessible only by ladders or narrow handholds carved into stone. Picture a woman in her 20s, basket of maize strapped to her back, inching up a vertical trail to reach her dwelling high above the canyon floor. Suddenly, fetching food feels like an expedition in itself. Their spiritual practices, too, reflected resilience. Within the kivas, ceremonial chambers built into the floor, were sipapus, small openings representing the place where humans emerged from the underworld. At Spruce Tree House, one such sipapu was filled with turquoise beads, likely an offering to the spirits during hard times. Perhaps the people hoped their generosity might coax rain from the heavens. Turquoise, after all, was sacred, mined from New Mexico and traded as far as central Mexico. And their trade connections went beyond stone. Scarlet macaws, with feathers blazing like fire, were imported from Mesoamerica. Imagine a brightly squawking parrot in a desert canyon, kept alive despite drought and scarcity. It wasn't practicality, it was a statement: we may be suffering, but we are still magnificent. While drought gnawed at the southwest and maize fields strained in Cahokia, the people of the northwest coast lived in a world of abundance. The Haida, Tlingit, and Kwakwaka'wakw thrived on the ocean's endless gifts. Salmon filled their rivers, whales breached offshore, and cedar forests provided both shelter and spirit. Their homes reflected this prosperity, longhouses made of cedar planks, some vast enough to hold entire extended families. The fronts of these dwellings were adorned with towering totem poles, carved with animals, spirits, and ancestral figures, each one telling the story of a clan's lineage. Imagine arriving at a village where the very walls around you spoke, every carving declaring identity and history as boldly as any written chronicle. At sites like Launce in British Columbia, archaeologists uncovered bentwood boxes, cedar steamed and folded into watertight containers without a single nail. Families used them to hold dried fish, sacred regalia, or treasured goods. Many were painted with distinctive shapes, ovoid and U-form designs, that remain iconic in Northwest Coast art today. These motifs were more than decoration, they were family emblems, cultural signatures, carrying the weight of identity like coats of arms, but executed with far more style and grace. Status here was expressed in unusual ways. One tradition involved labrets, lip ornaments carved from bone, wood, or stone. The size of the plug reflected rank. The larger the ornament, the greater the prestige. Picture a high-ranking man in his 40s, seated proudly at a feast, his lips stretched by a polished stone disc. Eating soup might have been a challenge, but the ornament declared his authority without words. In the realm of fashion, it made high heels seem practical. And the feasts themselves, the potlatches, were legendary. Chiefs gathered their people for days of singing, dancing, and endless food, but the true power lay in what was given away. Blankets, carved boxes, canoes, even slaves, all distributed to show wealth and cement loyalty. In some oral traditions, chiefs even burned their possessions, setting blankets aflame simply to prove that they had more than enough. Nothing said power like discarding wealth in front of your rivals. Meanwhile, far to the east, the Mississippian culture spread beyond Cahokia, establishing powerful centers at Moundville in Alabama and Etowah in Georgia. Moundville rose with nearly 30 earthworks encircled by a protective palisade, suggesting the threat of conflict was always present. At Etowah, copper plates have been found depicting warriors in elaborate regalia, dancers adorned with eagle feathers, brandishing severed heads. These were not images meant to soothe. They spoke of prestige rooted in violence, of societies where war and ceremony walked hand in hand. Even the pottery carried an unsettling power. Some Mississippian vessels bore the weeping Ith motif, faces etched with stylized tears streaming downward. Were these signs of mourning? Symbols of triumph? Or messages lost to us entirely? To hold one is to feel a ghostly presence, as though the clay itself grieves for the world that shaped it. And in the canyons of the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans left their own stories carved in stone. Petroglyphs show warriors with shields raised, clubs ready, etched into desert rock where echoes carry for miles. One even depicts a figure with what looks like a mohawk, whether hairstyle, headdress, or pure imagination, it speaks to individuality. Perhaps it wasn't punk rock in the 12th century, but it reminds us these were not faceless people. They lived, fought, celebrated, and expressed themselves with as much variety and character as we do today. In the great centers of Native America, power was never equally shared. In Cahokia, the elites controlled access to sacred spaces and exotic goods, shells, copper, and finely carved ornaments flowed through their hands, while the majority labored in the fields. Priests or clan leaders dictated ceremonies atop the mound-top temples, their voices carrying across plazas filled with smoke and song. In Chaco Canyon, the story was much the same. Towering great houses and cavernous kivas spoke of a religious hierarchy guiding life, with decisions tied as much to ritual as to governance. Along the northwest coast, hereditary chiefs reigned, but their authority rested on generosity. A chief who withheld gifts quickly lost loyalty. In these lands, power wasn't only seized, it had to be performed, displayed, and constantly renewed. For those at the bottom of the ladder, the cost of building civilizations was etched into their very bones. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons of women with worn joints, stress fractures, and spines bent from long hours of grinding maize on stone slabs or weaving fibers into baskets and cloth. Men, too, bore scars of overwork, fractured ribs, worn knees, and calloused hands frozen in bone. A city might rise toward the sky, but it did so on the bent backs of its laborers. Civilization brought ceremony, art, and monuments, but not everyone shared the view from the top of the mound. By 1300 CE, the cracks in this world were widening. Cahokia's vast population began to thin, possibly drained by overfarming, deforestation, and unrest between classes. Fields, once abundant, turned barren. Timber was stripped from forests until the land itself seemed weary. In the southwest, drought stretched across decades, forcing families to leave their cliffside homes at Mesa Verde and Chaco. Carrying baskets of maize and water jars, they moved toward new places such as Hopi Mesa, seeking survival in lands that still held promise. The northwest coast fared better, its rivers thick with salmon and its forests still green. Villages continued to thrive, but rivalries simmered as clans fought over trade routes and access to the best fishing grounds. Even abundance carried the seeds of conflict. Yet this was not the end. It was a pivot. The 13th and 14th centuries marked a crossroads, upheaval, yes, but also reinvention. Native Americans were not fading away, they were adapting. New power centers rose in the southeast, with places like Moundville in Alabama and Etowah in Georgia taking the mantle of influence. Moundville, with 29 mounds arranged around a broad central plaza, housed only about 1,000 people directly, but its reach extended across the region. It was less a city than a ceremonial hub, a stage where elites displayed power from the tops of their mounds while commoners lived in surrounding villages. Across the continent, the story was the same: shifting centers, resilient adaptations, and societies finding new ways to thrive in a changing world. From the ceremonial splendor of Moundville to the enduring coastal clans of the Northwest, the Native American story entered a new age, one of resilience, innovation, and occasional quirks that still leave us wondering what drove their choices. At Moundville, the artisans of the Mississippian world revealed a creativity that still sparks debate today. Their pottery bore intricate motifs, some depicting open hands marked with eyes, designs that seem almost futuristic, as if they belonged in a science fiction tale rather than a ceremonial plaza in 13th-century Alabama. Were these symbols of clan identity, emblems of spiritual power, or simply the handiwork of an imaginative potter with a flair for the dramatic? No one can say for certain, but the mystery is precisely what makes the designs so captivating. Each vessel whispers of meaning we can't quite decode, a reminder of how much is still hidden in the soil. The Mississippians also continued their beloved game of chunky, where a polished stone disc was rolled across the ground and players hurled spears to land as close as possible. To us, it sounds like simple sport, but oral traditions passed down through later peoples like the Cherokee suggest the stakes could be immense. Matches may have decided disputes or sealed political alliances, turning play into a ritualized battleground. Imagine the tension: a crowd gathered on a summer afternoon, two rival leaders wagering goods, land, perhaps even peace itself, all on the path of a single rolling stone. Archaeologists have even found chunky stones buried with their owners, as though one's skill, or lack of it, followed into the afterlife. Losing, in other words, might have haunted you forever. Meanwhile, far to the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans were writing their own chapter of resilience. The drought that had withered Chaco Canyon's fields around 1130 CE lingered for generations, and by 1300 families had spread to new lands, the Hopi Mesas, the Zuni Valley, and beyond. Here, they built compact villages of stone and adobe, smaller than the sprawling great houses of earlier centuries but carefully designed for survival. Farmers adapted with brilliant strategies, planting maize, beans, and squash in waffle gardens, sunken squares of soil that trapped precious rainwater. Some even arranged their crops in spirals, maximizing shade and moisture in ways that would have impressed even the most meticulous modern farmer. To stumble upon one today is to see a crop circle with a purpose. Storage was equally ingenious. At Acoma Pueblo and other sites, niches were carved into cliffs to safeguard grain from both raiders and rodents. Offerings were tucked into hidden places as well, turquoise beads and macaw feathers cached in rocky crevices, perhaps gifts to the spirits in exchange for fertile fields. Those scarlet macaws, imported all the way from Mesoamerica, were marvels in themselves. Bright, noisy birds carried hundreds of miles through deserts where water was rarer than gold. To keep such creatures alive in those conditions was no small feat, it was a statement of wealth, reach, and devotion. And on the northwest coast, abundance shaped life in entirely different ways. The Haida, Tlingit, and Kwakwaka'wakw lived in longhouses crafted from cedar logs so massive they seemed like palaces of wood, with carved beams depicting ravens, bears, and orcas. Entire clans, sometimes up to 100 people, shared these monumental homes, filling them with firelight, feasts, and stories. Outside, totem poles rose into the sky. Often mistaken as idols, they were in truth storybooks in wood, recording ancestry, clan rites, and mythic encounters. One pole from Haida Gwaii depicts a bear devouring a human, a striking image, perhaps a cautionary tale, perhaps a celebration of strength. Whatever its meaning, it stood as both history and art, proof that even in the age of hunger, drought, and rivalry, people never stopped finding ways to tell their stories. On the northwest coast, prestige was measured not only by what you owned, but by what you could give away, or even destroy. Potlatches remained the grand events of the region, where chiefs displayed their wealth in spectacles of generosity. At these gatherings, blankets, canoes, and carved boxes were distributed freely, a chief's reputation rising with every gift. But sometimes, generosity went one step further. Copper shields, valuable plaques engraved with clan symbols, were deliberately broken as a show of extravagance. Imagine smashing a fortune in front of your guests just to prove you didn't need it. Some of these copper pieces were so valuable they were worth thousands of blankets, enough to represent the economy of an entire community. The message was clear: wealth was not about hoarding, it was about flexing power, creating stories that would be retold for generations. While the coastal clans perfected the art of status, far to the northeast, a different experiment in society was taking root. By 1000 CE, the ancestors of the Iroquois in present-day New York and Ontario were building longhouses, massive timber structures stretching nearly 200 feet. Each longhouse sheltered multiple families, with fire pits glowing down the central corridor and smoke curling through roof vents. These weren't just homes, they were communities under one roof, with alliances and kinship woven into every wall. The forests fed them with deer, turkeys, and the sweet sap of maples, which they boiled into syrup. Maize fields flourished outside, but it was the forest and the women who sustained the heart of Iroquois life. In this society, women held remarkable power. They controlled the fields and the distribution of food, ensuring no one ate without their say. While men hunted or waged war, it was women who decided who thrived and who hungered. This matrilineal authority flipped the expectations of most patriarchal systems, reminding us that power in native societies often carried a very different balance. And like their Mississippian neighbors, the Iroquois had their own beloved game. A precursor to modern lacrosse, it could last for days and involve entire villages. Called the little brother of war, it was no casual pastime. It trained warriors, settled disputes, and honored the spirits. Picture two teams, hundreds of players at once, darting across open fields, hurling a leather ball with sticks decorated in feathers and animal teeth. It was part competition, part ritual, part preparation for war. Against that backdrop, even our modern sports feel tame. On the Great Plains, other peoples were adapting to the vast grasslands in ingenious ways. The ancestors of the Lakota and Cheyenne became master bison hunters, their bows and arrows replacing the otlotl as lighter, faster weapons. Long before horses arrived, they learned to work with the land itself. Entire herds were driven toward cliffs in orchestrated chaos, where dozens of animals plunged to their deaths in what archaeologists call bison jumps. At places like Head Smashed in Alberta, mountains of bones tell the story of these massive hunts. Brutal as it seems, it was efficient. One dangerous stampede could feed and clothe a community for months. By this time, native societies across the continent were diversifying. Some measured power and wealth burned at feasts, others in the authority of women over harvests, and still others in their ability to orchestrate a bison stampede. Civilization was not a single pattern, but a patchwork of strategies, each rooted in the landscape, each carrying its own quirks, triumphs, and costs. By the late 14th century, social divisions were etched clearly into the landscapes of the Americas. In the southeast, Mississippian elites lived high atop their mounds, their temples and homes rising above the farmers laboring in the fields below, a physical reminder of the class divide. In the southwest, clans controlled access to kivas and sacred rituals, holding spiritual authority that placed them above ordinary villagers. And on the northwest coast, power often rested in wealth and lineage, but it was also sustained through slavery. Captives taken during raids were bound into servitude, some eventually earning freedom, others not. Even in these vibrant cultures, shadows lingered, proof that complexity carried both brilliance and brutality. The evidence of conflict and hardship is written in the bones. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons from this era scarred with arrow wounds across the Great Plains and crushed skulls in the southeast. These injuries speak of battles fought over land, hunting grounds, and prestige. And in the southwest, an even darker controversy emerges. At sites like Cowboy Wash in Colorado, bones dating to around 1150 CE bear cut marks and signs of burning, as though they had been butchered. Was this desperate cannibalism during a time of famine? Or ritual, rooted in spiritual belief? We may never know for certain, but the discovery forces us to pause. Those cliff dwellings, so often admired for their ingenuity, may also have witnessed moments of grim necessity or ceremonial violence. By 1400 CE, however, the Americas were anything but stagnant. Across the continent, cultures adapted with energy and invention. The Mississippians consolidated their influence in centers like Moundville and Etowah, maintaining vibrant trade networks that tied the southeast together. In the desert, the ancestral Puebloans perfected their resilient villages, stone and adobe clusters built to withstand both raiders and drought. Along the northwest coast, clans doubled down on abundance, hosting feasts so extravagant they could rival the budgets of modern corporations. Chiefs measured their power not by what they kept but by what they gave away, burning wealth to prove they had plenty more. Meanwhile, in the northeast, the ancestors of the Iroquois Confederacy were weaving together one of the most sophisticated political systems in the Americas, one that would later astonish Europeans with its complexity. Longhouses stretched across forests, women held sway over food and land, and councils gathered to debate war, peace, and trade. Their innovations in governance set them apart, creating bonds that would endure for centuries. But this world, as vibrant as it was not unchanging. Climate shifts pressed on harvests, trade rivalries stoked tensions, and whispers of unfamiliar ships soon to appear on distant shores would ripple through oral traditions. By the dawn of the 15th century, native societies were thriving, reinventing, and sometimes indulging in practices that make us raise an eyebrow today. They weren't merely enduring, they were building, celebrating, experimenting, and setting the stage for a dramatic new chapter in their story. At Moundville and Etowah, Mississippian artisans reached a level of craftsmanship so refined that many of their creations would not look out of place in a modern museum. Pottery bore intricate carvings, animal forms, and polished surfaces that shimmered in firelight. One vessel in particular, shaped like a duck with carefully etched feathers, raises questions even now. Was it a sacred offering? A ceremonial water jug? Or perhaps the potter's playful attempt at humor? Whatever the purpose, one can imagine the pride, or laughter, when the finished piece was first shown to the community. These objects carried stories as much as function, a blend of artistry and spirit that has outlasted centuries. Agriculture remained the backbone of Mississippian life, with maize at its center. But corn was not alone in their fields. They cultivated amaranth, sunflowers, and even tobacco, plants that carried meanings far beyond food. Tobacco, in particular, was sacred. It was smoked during rituals, offered in alliances, and burned in ceremonies as a way to commune with spirits. Archaeologists have even discovered pipes still bearing chemical traces of not only tobacco but also datura, a hallucinogenic plant. Picture a shaman, pipe in hand, surrounded by villagers in silence. As smoke curled skyward, visions of serpents or winged beings might fill their sight, guiding decisions and binding the people together. For the rest of the community, it may have felt ordinary. For the shaman, it was a glimpse into other worlds. Life, however, was not all ritual and farming. Conflict simmered across the southeast, and villages adapted with defenses. Sites like Okmulgee in Georgia show moats and stockades rising around settlements, proof that neighbors were not always friendly. Warfare left its mark not just in bones but in chilling artifacts. At Etowah, archaeologists uncovered a preserved human scalp, treated with ochre and clay. Was it a war trophy, or part of a ritual offering to the gods. Either way, it was not a keepsake for the faint of heart. Even games carried heavy weight. Chunky, the stone disc throwing game, could be more than pastime. Oral traditions suggest that wagers could reach staggering stakes: land, resources, even lives. Imagine rolling a disc across packed earth, spear ready in your hand, while knowing your farm, your family's future, perhaps even your life, rested on where the stone finally stopped. The tension must have been electric, every throw carrying more than sport. Meanwhile, in the dry canyons of the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans were adapting to a new era. By 1400 CE, they had left behind Chaco's great houses, settling instead in villages at the Hopi Mesas and Zuni Valley. These pueblos were compact, made of stone and adobe, designed as much for defense as for community. Narrow doorways, ladders to the roofs, and walls packed tightly together made them nearly impregnable, a kind of fortress apartment complex rising out of the desert. Farmers worked tirelessly to coax crops from dry soils. Check dams trapped rainfall, terraces captured runoff, and at Zuni, fields were planted at the mouths of arroyos to harness flash floods in a technique known as chin irrigation. Farming here was a gamble with the weather, but one they often managed to win. Their artistry thrived alongside their farming. Puebloan potters created striking black-on-white geometric designs that would not look out of place in a modern art gallery. One mug found at Chaco bore a handle shaped like a frog, functional, yes, but also whimsical, proof that creativity thrived even in harsh environments. They wove cotton, imported from Mesoamerica, spinning it into blankets and fine clothing. Yet the toll of labor was visible. Skeletons of women from this period show worn, grooved fingers, testament to long hours spent weaving thread and shaping clay. Behind every artifact, every design, was a life of work, imagination, and resilience. Every woven blanket, every patterned tunic, carried with it the weight of countless hours of labor. The Puebloan women who spun cotton or yucca fibers into thread, then wove them into textiles, left behind not only art but also silent testimony to the endurance of their hands. Each groove worn deep into their bones tells us that beauty often came with sacrifice. These weren't just garments, they were the physical record of entire lives dedicated to skill and tradition. Far to the northwest, the Haida, Tlingit, and Kwakwaka'wakw entered what might be called a golden age. Their cedar longhouses had grown into architectural marvels, vast structures with carved posts and beams that proclaimed clan history in wood. Totem poles rose taller than ever, some stretching 50 feet into the air, etched with thunderbird, raven, and figures from myths that tied the living to the spirit world. One pole uncovered in a Tlingit village depicts a man astride a killer whale, said to be a tale of a warrior who tamed the sea itself. To those who saw it, the carving was more than art, it was legend brought to life, as bold as any action story we tell today. Potlatches, too, reached their height in this era. Chiefs gave away everything from canoes to blankets, from boxes filled with smoked salmon to human captives, each event outshining the last. One particularly curious tradition involved copper shields, treasured plaques engraved with clan symbols. A chief might present one as a gift, only for the recipient to break it, shattering the symbol of wealth to prove they were just as rich. Imagine handing someone a jeweled watch and watching them smash it on the spot. Prestige, in this world, was measured in audacity. Trade flourished along the coast, stretching as far south as California and north into Alaska. Abalone shells, obsidian, and long tubular shells known as dentalium passed through countless hands, acting as both currency and ornament. Picture buying a canoe with a string of seashells. It sounds impossible, yet it worked, binding communities into a vast network of commerce and culture. Meanwhile, in the forests of the Northeast, another kind of power was being forged. By 1450 CE, oral traditions tell of the formation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, uniting 5 nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, into a political alliance unlike anything else on the continent. This was no casual agreement. It was codified in the Great Law of Peace, a constitution passed down orally, guiding the council fires where leaders debated matters of war, peace, and trade. Wampum beads, delicately carved from quahog shells, were woven into belts that recorded treaties and history. These belts were both art and archive, jewelry that served as law. In their longhouses, where as many as 20 families might live together, power flowed in surprising directions. Women held authority over the land and food stores, and they alone chose the chiefs. If a leader failed in his duty, the women could strip him of his headdress, dehorning him in a symbolic dismissal. Imagine a council chamber where the women could fire the leader by removing the hat that crowned him, decisive, elegant, and absolute. Their lacrosse matches mirrored their political intensity. Games could last for days, with hundreds of players chasing the ball across miles of forest. One tradition speaks of a match so fierce it stretched into its third day, with players collapsing from exhaustion. It was not just sport, it was diplomacy, training, and ritual rolled into one, a marathon with sticks that bound communities through competition. Out on the Great Plains, life was still tied to the thunder of hooves. The ancestors of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and others pursued bison with bows and arrows, mastering strategies that turned the prairie itself into a hunting ground. These were societies that measured wealth in hides and meat, where the land itself was both challenge and gift. On the Great Plains, the ancestors of the Lakota and Cheyenne were refining their hunting strategies with remarkable ingenuity. Instead of relying solely on dangerous cliff jumps, some groups built corrals, large wooden enclosures used to funnel and trap bison herds. This method made hunts safer and more predictable, ensuring that families could harvest food, hides, and bone without as much risk. Hunting, however, was never just a practical matter, it carried a sacred weight. Before great drives, hunters painted their bodies with red ochre, believing the pigment shielded them with spiritual power. At a site in Montana, archaeologists discovered the skeleton of a man whose bones were still stained with ochre centuries later. It wasn't just decoration, it was commitment, a ritual uniform worn into battle with the most important prey on the continent. Elsewhere, challenges mounted. In the southeast, Mississippian centers were straining against their own success. Overfarming and soil exhaustion pushed families to relocate, leaving once bustling plazas quieter than before. In the southwest, droughts persisted, forcing Puebloan communities to cluster into smaller, more defensible villages, stone fortresses built to guard every drop of water and every precious harvest. Along the northwest coast, abundance still fueled feasts, but rivalries over fishing grounds and trade routes sparked raids and skirmishes that kept villages wary. And in the northeast, oral traditions of the Haudenosaunee recall bitter wars fought before their confederacy united the nations, battles for fertile valleys and hunting grounds. Skeletal remains from this period tell the same story, arrowheads lodged in ribs, fractured skulls, and scars etched deep into bone. Peace, when it came, was earned the hard way. Even the art of the time reflected these tensions and mysteries. In Mississippian sites, potters shaped vessels decorated with creatures both terrifying and strange, beasts with wings, fangs, and multiple heads. Were they depictions of mythological spirits, warnings of rival enemies, or something entirely symbolic? We may never know. To modern eyes, the vessels look like props pulled straight from a fantasy epic, proof that the imagination of these people stretched as far as their engineering and political skills. As the 15th century drew to a close, Native America was not a world in decline but a vibrant mosaic at its peak. Moundville and Etowah still rose proudly in the southeast, centers of trade and ceremony. Puebloan farmers, hardened by drought, perfected their desert survival with irrigation systems and compact villages carved into stone. Along the Pacific, the Haida, Tlingit, and others hosted potlatches that could rival the splendor of any royal wedding. In the northeast, the Iroquois were weaving together a political masterpiece, building councils and laws that would echo far into the future. But just beyond the horizon, something new was stirring. Strange sails were nearing, carrying people whose arrival would shatter the rhythms of this world. The decades leading up to 1492 were a snapshot of brilliance before the storm, a time of creativity, resilience, and audacity that proved these societies were not simply surviving, but thriving. The stage was set for a clash that would alter the continent forever. By the late 15th century, Mississippian centers had evolved into full-fledged chiefdoms, complex societies with powerful rulers presiding over networks of villages. In Spanish chronicles written decades later, places like Ceuta were described as realms where a paramount chief commanded dozens of tributary towns, his authority resembling that of a medieval king. But instead of castles and crowns, his symbols of power were maize, mounds, and ritual. Their towns were built with defense in mind. Archaeologists have uncovered massive post holes where towering palisades once stood, and in some places, evidence suggests the walls were reinforced with clay-coated logs to resist fire. Imagine an enemy torching your walls, only to watch the flames sputter uselessly against hardened mud. It was a clever trick, a classic Mississippian move, showing their mastery of both war and engineering. The artisans of these towns continued to impress, shaping pottery that could rival body art in intricacy. From Moundville, one remarkable ceramic bottle shaped like a catfish has survived, its fins and gaping mouth sculpted in detail so vivid you can almost hear it splashing. Was it meant to hold sacred water, to serve stew at a feast, or simply to show off an artisan's skill? We may never know. But one can picture the pride of its maker, unveiling it at a gathering where friends and rivals alike marveled at the craftsmanship. Feasting was central to Mississippian life. Excavated cooking pits contain the bones of deer, turtles, and countless fish, evidence of communal meals that brought hundreds together. In some pits, archaeologists even found alligator bones, a sign that groups were either trading with coastal neighbors or raiding them. Imagine sitting at a feast in Alabama, eating roasted venison and turtle soup with a side of alligator, an early barbecue menu that rivals any modern cookout. Spiritual life was equally vital. At Spiro, artisans carved pipes from stone in the likeness of human faces, some with closed eyes as if caught in trance. Residue tests on these pipes reveal more than just tobacco, they also contain sumac and other herbs, suggesting a blend used for medicine, visions, or ritual journeys. Picture a chief seated cross-legged, inhaling smoke that blurred the edges of reality, spirits rising with the haze, while those around him watched in solemn awe. In Mississippian society, spiritual influence was as important as political power. To lead, you had to master both worlds. Meanwhile, in the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans were thriving in villages built to endure. By the late 1400s, Hopi and Zuni pueblos were bustling, their multi-story homes stacked like stone fortresses against the desert cliffs. Flat rooftops doubled as drying racks for corn and as lookouts for approaching raiders. Farmers mastered dryland agriculture, planting maize and beans in low-lying fields that captured runoff. At Acoma, they even constructed stone-lined reservoirs to catch rainfall, some of which still function today, a testament to their skill. Their pottery blossomed into new forms as well. Black-on-white geometric styles gave way to bold polychrome designs, reds, yellows, whites swirling in mesmerizing patterns. One vessel from Hawiku depicts a supernatural figure, perhaps a rain spirit, painted in dramatic detail. These beings, known as kachinas, were woven deeper into Pueblo belief, embodying the forces of nature on which life depended. In every jar, every painted line, the desert and the divine converged, capturing a worldview where survival and spirituality could never be separated. In the Southwest, Puebloan villages were alive with ritual and ceremony. Religion and daily life intertwined so tightly that you couldn't separate them. During great festivals, dancers masked themselves as spirits, embodying rain, fertility, or the winds themselves. Picture an entire community gathered in a plaza, the air thick with drumbeats, as masked figures twirled and stamped to summon the clouds. Elders murmured prayers while children craned their necks skyward, waiting to see if the dancers' movements would coax rain from the horizon. Faith was not abstract, it was lived, performed, and measured in harvests. Trade networks tied them to far-off lands. Puebloan turquoise made its way south, exchanged with Mesoamerican merchants for cacao and macaw feathers. Imagine sipping chocolate in the heart of the desert, or raising a brightly plumed parrot whose feathers glowed like fire under the sun. These exchanges weren't just practical, they brought color, flavor, and wonder into daily life, proof of a world connected by trails stretching across deserts and mountains. Meanwhile, on the northwest coast, the Haida, Tlingit, and Kwakwaka'wakw were flourishing. Their longhouses had become cultural and social centers, vast cedar structures with carved screens dividing family spaces and clan crests painted across the walls. Totem poles towered outside, each one a carved story, of lineage, myth, or warning. In one Tsimshian village, a pole depicted a frog swallowing a man whole. Was it a cautionary tale against greed? A reminder not to offend the spirits? Either way, it was an image meant to leave a lasting impression, a story etched in cedar for all to see. Potlatches grew ever grander, binding society together with acts of generosity that were as competitive as they were ceremonial. Chiefs gave away canoes, blankets, and food to secure prestige or shame their rivals. One unusual spectacle involved grease feasts. Oil from the Yulakan fish was poured into fires, igniting massive flames that roared into the night. Imagine standing in a crowd as your host sets fire to barrels of oil, not out of recklessness but as a demonstration of abundance. In this world, fire itself could be currency. The northwest coast economy thrived on trade. Dentalium shells served as currency, obsidian and furs traveled along the coast, and human captives taken in raids were folded into this system. Some enslaved individuals were given high-status roles, such as managing the wealth of a chief. Others were freed, or sacrificed, at potlatches. It was a society both sophisticated and unsettling, where power was always tied to spectacle. In the forests of the northeast, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was taking shape, binding 5 nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, into a single alliance under the Great Law of Peace. By the late 1400s, a council of 50 chiefs, chosen by clan mothers, governed through consensus. This system, balanced and deliberate, would echo centuries later in the democratic ideals of the United States. Wampum belts served as both currency and contract, their beaded designs recording treaties and promises. One famous example, the 2-row wampum, symbolized peace between nations, 2 parallel lines of beads, separate yet equal, representing paths that never crossed yet endured together. It was law written in art, still honored today. Everyday life for the Iroquois revolved around longhouses and agriculture. Women oversaw the great fields of maize, beans, and squash, the 3 sisters that sustained entire villages. Men hunted deer, fished the rivers, and trained for warfare. And when the work was done, lacrosse brought communities together in games that could last for days. Hundreds of players covered miles of field, bodies painted with red ochre, charms hanging from their necks. Some believed the paint gave them speed, others that it called upon spirits for protection. To outside eyes, it might look like chaos, to them, it was a sacred blend of sport, ritual, and preparation for life's battles. Life in the late 15th century was a constant balance of ritual, survival, and conflict. Along the forest trails of the Northeast, warriors trained not only for sport but for war. Lacrosse, already fierce enough to last days, doubled as preparation for raiding and defense. Imagine sprinting through a woodland clearing, dodging sticks, a charm swinging from your neck for luck, while knowing tomorrow that same agility might save your life in battle. Warfare was never far away. Raids were carried out to avenge fallen kin, capture prisoners, or secure hunting territories. Archaeologists uncover the scars in the soil, skeletons marked with scalping cuts, fractured skulls, and embedded arrowheads, a stark reminder that peace was fragile, always hard-won. On the Great Plains, bison hunting was evolving into a cultural institution. Groups like the ancestors of the Lakota and Cheyenne worked together in massive communal hunts, driving herds into corrals or over cliffs. At Vor Buffalo Jump in Wyoming, archaeologists uncovered the bones of thousands of bison, layer upon layer, evidence of centuries of repeated drives. These weren't isolated events, they were seasonal rituals that bound communities together in both labor and feasting. And nothing went to waste. Meat became food for winter, hides became clothing and lodge coverings, bones were shaped into tools, and even dried dung served as fuel for fires. It was a zero-waste way of life, born not of trend but of necessity, proof of their intimate relationship with the herds that sustained them. But hunting wasn't just about survival. On the open plains, great stone circles known as medicine wheels began to appear. Built from carefully arranged rocks, some aligned with solstices or star patterns, they may have served as ceremonial sites, navigational markers, or astronomical observatories. At Big Horn in Wyoming, one wheel stretches across 80 feet, its spokes pointing toward key positions of the sun and stars. These alignments suggest that even nomadic hunters were also philosophers, looking skyward to understand their place in the cosmos. As the 15th century drew to a close, the native world was at its peak, diverse, dynamic, and resilient. The Mississippians still ruled their mound-top domains, orchestrating ceremonies in plazas that pulsed with life. Puebloan farmers perfected desert agriculture, coaxing maize from the driest soils. Along the Pacific, the Haida and Tlingit threw feasts so extravagant they rivaled royal courts. In the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy wove together diplomacy that balanced power with peace. On the plains, hunters moved in unison with the bison, precision guiding their survival. Yet the horizon was no longer empty. Strange sails appeared across the seas, carrying people who would bring upheaval on a scale no one could have imagined. In 1492, Christopher Columbus and his crew stumbled into the Caribbean, not into an empty wilderness, but into lands alive with people, traditions, and histories already thousands of years old. On islands like Hispaniola, the Taino thrived, cultivating cassava, fishing turquoise waters, and living in societies as rich and complex as any across the continents. The stage was set for a collision, an age of encounters, adaptation, and resistance. The brilliance of Native America stood ready to meet a storm that would test every ounce of resilience they had built over millennia. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean, he encountered the Taino, a thriving society of farmers, fishers, and traders. Their fields, known as canucos, stretched across the islands, producing cassava, maize, and tobacco in rich abundance. Villages of thousands lived in palm-thatched houses called bohayos, their chiefs, or caciques, overseeing alliances, trade, and ceremony. Life was not just work, it was culture. The Taino played a ball game called baity, using a solid rubber ball on stone-lined courts. Long before basketball or soccer, these matches carried stakes of tribute, honor, and pride. Imagine a court filled with cheering villagers, the ball bouncing unpredictably, and two teams vying for more than just victory. To the arriving Europeans, everything seemed foreign. Columbus, convinced he had reached Asia, called the Taino Indians, a mislabel that stuck for centuries. He wrote of their generosity, noting how they offered him parrots, gold ornaments, and food. But he often misunderstood what he saw. One famous example was the cotton hammock, a central part of Taino daily life. Columbus thought they were nets for catching people, a cultural misreading that almost sounds comedic if it weren't so tragic. The generosity of first encounters quickly soured. Spanish demands for gold grew relentless, and when there wasn't enough, they turned to enslavement and violence. By the 1510s, the Taino population collapsed under disease, forced labor, and brutality. Yet resistance flared. In 1511, the leader Otway led a rebellion against the Spaniards. Captured and sentenced to be burned alive, he refused baptism when offered salvation. He asked if Spaniards went to heaven, and when told yes, he chose hell instead, preferring it to sharing eternity with his oppressors. Picture him standing before the flames, defiance blazing brighter than the fire. His courage became legend, echoing across generations. Meanwhile, in the southeast, Mississippian chiefdoms still thrived when Hernando de Soto marched north from Florida in 1539. His expedition met powerful centers like Coosa and Coffetechequi. At Coffetechequi, he encountered a female chief remembered as the Lady of Coffetechequi. She greeted him carried on a litter, adorned with pearls, and showered him with gifts of furs and jewels. One pearl, the size of a hazelnut, was placed in his hands, a gesture that may have been both hospitality and political statement. But De Soto repaid her generosity with treachery, kidnapping her to serve as his guide. Her people endured, trading maize, hides, and crafted goods, even as disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, crept silently into their communities, reshaping their world before many realized what had come. Farther west, the ancestral Puebloans still lived in their pueblos, clustered in places like Acoma and Zuni. When Francisco Vázquez de Coronado arrived in 1540 chasing fables of golden cities, he found no wealth glittering in streets, only well-organized villages where people farmed maize, wove cotton cloth, and stored food in ingenious stone-built homes. At Acoma, perched on a 367-foot mesa, villagers rained stones and arrows down on the armored Spaniards, turning the cliffs into natural fortresses. Coronado's men, weighed down by rattling steel that clinked like tin cans, earned the nickname, the men who sound like rattles, in Zuni oral traditions. To the Puebloans, the strangers must have seemed both terrifying and strange, part human, part clanking apparition. On the northwest coast, long before European sails appeared on their horizon, the Haida, Tlingit, and Kwakwaka'wakw were perfecting a maritime world unlike anything else in the Americas. Their cedar canoes, carved from single massive logs, could stretch 70 feet in length, sleek and strong enough to carry entire crews into open waters. These vessels were the pride of their people, used for trading along vast coastal routes, raiding rival villages, and even hunting the giants of the sea. Whaling was the pinnacle of this skill. Hunters launched bone-tipped harpoons coated in seal fat, the slick surface helping them cut cleanly through water. Imagine the courage it took, paddling in rhythm, waves crashing against the hull, and striking a whale that outweighed their canoe 100 times over. To succeed was not just survival, it was proof of mastery over both sea and spirit. Ceremony was never far from daily life. Potlatches remained the great stage of power, where chiefs gave away carved boxes, blankets, and copper shields to secure status and honor. One striking find tells of this devotion. A copper shield engraved with a raven was discovered buried beneath the floor of a longhouse. Perhaps it was a gift to the spirits, a chief's attempt to carry prestige into the afterlife. To us, it looks like burying treasure, to them, it was legacy made tangible. Meanwhile, in the forests of the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was becoming a political powerhouse. By the early 1500s, their councils governed wars, alliances, and trade with remarkable sophistication.